So Fran, could you take a minute to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Fran Maier. I'm special assistant to the local Archbishop Chaput. When we get into our remarks, I'll go into a little bit more detail about that, but I've worked for him for 20 years. I had the same job in Denver. My family moved with the Archbishop when he was appointed to Philadelphia, and I've been doing some form of the current job that I've got for 39 years.
I'm Mary Ryder. I came on board in the early 80s with Pro-Lifers for Survival and helped to transition Pro-Lifers for Survival, which was just about nuclear weapons and abortion, to the Seamless Garment Network, which is now the Consistent Life Network. The name change was not very meaningful. It just, we thought, was a clearer picture of who we were. But as you all know, we took on a few more issues from Pro-Lifers for Survival to today. And so I've been in and out officially with the organization since before I was born. And I live in North Carolina with my husband, Patrick, and well, our 8 children, most of whom now have grown up, but not all.
My name is Evelyn Brush. I currently am employed as a Director of Religious Education for a very small multicultural parish in Portland, Oregon. But I claim to be from the smallest diocese in the country, which is Baker Diocese, where it's the size of Wisconsin. We have 36 parishes, 5 Catholic schools, and all but 2 are 100 miles apart, at least. And so very much the minority. And had never left Oregon. I went to graduate school at Chicago Catholic Theological Union on a full scholarship, and we chose to go back to Oregon for a few years to try it out. So I'm a Secular Franciscan for almost 40 years, and have lots of degrees and lots of things, and anything I was curious about, go off about it.
I'm Thad Crouch. I'm the National Program Coordinator of the Consistent Life Network, and I am an Army veteran who was confronted with, I used to do support work for the U.S. Army School of the Americas, thinking I was supporting freedom and democracy, and I was training death squads and torturers, and that confrontation, along with some prayer, over time converted me into nonviolence, and I've been active with Pax Christi and Veterans for Peace since the mid-90s. I've always been pro-life on abortion since I first heard about it as a child, and I was like, people do that? But I wasn't really actively pro-life until about 3 years ago, when I decided that I wanted to help get Pax Christi and our parish pro-life group, I'm Catholic, but working together. And I thought I would join the pro-life group and be related to them before I brought in or anything, and they converted me, and I'll talk more about that, into being active on pro-life. And we've been doing things with Pax Christi and Respect Life working together before I even knew that the Consistent Life Network existed.
So Fran, you have prepared remarks you'd like to start with?
I'm just going to work from notes, and I have my timer here. I'm starting now for 10 minutes. You know, people come to this work from a lot of different places. I was raised Catholic. My mom was a very intelligent woman who won a partial scholarship to one of the 7 sisters, and I turned her aside because she was one of 10, and she had to help work to support the family, but she had this intense interest in thought and reading and intellect, and so I was raised that way, and I was the first kid of my family that actually went to college. I was raised very Catholic. We were a very seriously Catholic family. Went to Notre Dame, immediately pulled the ripcord. Didn't have much to do with the church for about 3.5 years until I met a young woman that I was interested in, who ended up being my wife for the last 46 years. And one of the markers of our relationship was that I wasn't going to get to first base with her unless I, came aboard the church again. So I reluctantly did that. In terms of the issue of abortion, I was very, frankly, wasn't very interested in it, but she certainly was. And so, you know, I went along with conforming my thoughts to hers. Now, over time, I met men that had a profound influence on maturing my attitudes intellectually from a masculine point of view. But the real benchmark for us in terms of pro-life issues, aside from my wife's activism, was we have 4 kids. Our last son has Down syndrome. We have 10 grandchildren. 3 of them have severe to moderate disabilities. One of them is wheelchair bound, can't speak, and then 2 of the others, one of them has Turner syndrome, a young woman who's born without ovaries and some mental implications from that, and another grandson who has some brain malfunction. So, I mean, these things, you know, when you live with them, you deal with, you know, why would God do this? And they profoundly influence the way that we see that, the way that we approach the sanctity of life issue. Now, I worked for a boss who, at the beginning of his career as a young priest, was very active in the Democratic Party, very friendly to the Pax Christi movement, has remained throughout his ministry very pro-immigrant, pro-homeless, written dozens or actually scores of articles and given lots of talks about the death penalty, but he sees the foundational issue as abortion always has, always will. In terms of the way that, and so of course I'm okay with that, and I try to serve that in my task as being this kind of special assistant, which doesn't really exist in the church. It just happens to be a personal relationship that the Archbishop wanted, and we've developed over the last 20 years. My background, I was editor-in-chief of the National Catholic Register for 15 years, got recruited to Denver by then Archbishop Stafford as his communications director, and I've worked for Archbishop Chaput, as I said, ever since he came to Denver in 1997. I was also staff for him, primary staff for him, in the development of the U.S. Bishop's 1998 statement, Living the Gospel of Life. And that document has been critical to the Archbishop's thinking from then until now. If you go to, after this conversation, if you go to and just look at Living the Gospel of Life, that really represents his thinking, mainly because he's the primary drafter on it. He was tasked with writing that pastoral letter for the U.S. bishops with Cardinal Law, Cardinal O'Connor, and Bishop Jim, I forget his last name now, he used to be, he had a position in the USCCB, he's dead now, but I mean, the guy who was actually tasked with writing that document was Archbishop Chaput. Pardon me?
Was it Kelly?
No, it began with an M. It was an Irish name. If you go to paragraph 22 in Living the Gospel of Life, that one paragraph is the heart and soul of how the Archbishop approaches this issue. Now, a lot of people contributed to it, obviously. You don't get a letter through the USCCB without a lot of people having a whole lot to do with it. But I have a copy of the original document, and that document that was finally published is 85% what the Archbishop wrote. So I think that's the document to go to. I think the principles that we need to keep in mind in terms of approaching a discussion like this are very simple. You know, it's the Pauline line, speak the truth with love. It's really hard to do. As Thad indicated, we're probably all A personalities here. My temper gets up real quickly, and the last thing I was told before I left this morning was to smile a lot by my wife. Because look, you know, we're in a highly politicized environment. This country doesn't have a common vision of, doesn't have a common anthropological vision of who man is, what he is, who he comes from, what his purpose is, and so that, you know, as Alistair and McIntyre indicated in After Virtue, there's just this kind of armed camps that keep lobbing, you know, shells at each other. It's very, very difficult to have a compassionate and sensible discussion with people whom you don't share a common vision with. So speaking the truth with love is very important. I think assuming the best about the people you disagree with is another fundamental principle, and also really hard. I like to dislike the people I dislike, and it's just something that becomes, they must be bad because they don't agree with me. And then think before you speak.
you know, is again, I mean, our blood gets up fast when we're talking about things that are critical to us. And it's very important to just shut up and think about the basic principles of the discussion before you start, you know, mischaracterizing other people. The second principle that I would put, that I try to live by, I don't do it very well, but I try to live by, is understanding that there's only so much mental bandwidth in each life. In other words, my wife and I are completely absorbed with my job, with our kids, with the pro-life issue, and with the everyday problems that you deal with when you have, you know, disabled children and grandchildren, and then just want to live a happy life at the same time. You know, I don't work in a soup kitchen. I can't work in a soup kitchen. And I can't expect people who do to be active on the front lines on the pro-life issue, as I understand it with abortion, you know. That doesn't mean they're not pro-life. It just means that they don't have the mental bandwidth to handle all the issues at the same time. I think understanding that is really important, because it's easier to forgive people for not thinking exactly like you do when you realize that they just can't manage it all. I can't think about nuclear weapons when I'm trying to take care of, well, do we give these hormones to my daughter-in-law, to my granddaughter who doesn't have ovaries or not? Because if we don't, then she'll develop osteoporosis, and if we do, well then, you know, these alien hormones are being pumped into her body. I mean, that is all consuming. And if I keep that in mind, I'm a little bit more forgiving about people who don't see this issue exactly as I do. I've already talked about living the gospel of life. I think that's really one of the best documents the U.S. bishops have ever produced. And when we go into every election cycle, the Archbishop always talks about that document first before anything else is read, because it's a really beautiful explanation, I think, of the architecture of our moral reasoning on life. You know, all of these issues are important. None of them is unimportant. But from the Archbishop's perspective, and certainly this will be the perspective of my wife and myself, they're not all the same immediate weight. And the architecture is you don't kill the innocent intentionally, and you don't tolerate it, which underscores the reasons why genocide is bad, euthanasia is bad, abortion is bad. That doesn't mean that, well, you know, homelessness really isn't that big a problem. No, of course not. Medical, you know, health care is not an unimportant issue, but they can't all crowd into your mind at the same time with the same weight, or you don't get anything done, or you can't think logically about this issue. So that's kind of an overview of how I came to it and how I approach it. You know, honestly, the biggest problem I have when I go to confession every time is anger. I'm just angry all the time. And I think that's the way it is for an awfully lot of people in the culture right now, because there's just so much conflict and so much, that hair trigger mechanism is encouraged by a media that's very driven by sensationalism, and it keeps everybody tense without being able to think. And you have this kind of virus of anger. Oh, whoa. I guess that's enough of that.
Finish your thought. Finish your thought.
Anyway, you get the point. I mean, we're all living with this kind of constant stimulation that keeps us at this hair trigger brink that is extremely unhealthy and not getting us anywhere. And so a meeting like this, where people come together to try to understand each other around common interests, is, I think, really critical. That's all I've got to say.
When I was looking at like this idea of social justice and respect life, and I Googled it, almost everything that came up was Catholic. And I think that was on purpose. I think this is kind of a Catholic thought. But I like to think about these issues, and I think you're absolutely right. We can't do everything. None of us can do everything. We can do some things, you know, and some of us might be a jack of all trades and a master of none, but even then we can't do everything. We can just drop in on this a little bit or the list a little bit. But I think some of what was said earlier today, in that, you know, if at least we have our finger on the pulse of each of these issues, and we have a basic understanding of why we are opposed to these certain things, then we have a way of talking to each other on some common ground. So for me, when I was a young girl, Roe v. Wade was passed. I happened to live in the shadow of Washington, D.C., so even though I was young, I was very aware of what was going on. And I, like you said, I was appalled to find out what that was all about. And then as I grew older, I was introduced to other issues. I was very worried about hunger for a long time, and then I started to realize what were the roots of hunger. And I guess now in my older age, I would say that I've heard a lot of people say, well, abortion is about the taking of innocent life. But I want to tell you that all of these issues are about innocent life. But also that guilty lives matter too. So abortion absolutely is about the taking of innocent life. It also does great harm to women, whether they're innocent or guilty. It's misogynistic. That's for another day. But when you look at things like the death penalty, well, some people's argument is, well, the death penalty, we're taking the worst of the worst. No, we're not. The Innocence Project has determined, I don't even know what the number is now, but has found more than 100 cases of people on death row who were executed who were innocent. We have a friend in North Carolina who came off of death row after decades of living on death row, and now he's trying to live his life, having lived most of it on death row. But even if people aren't innocent, what does it mean to respect life? But I want to say, too, is that, you get that idea with war, too, like, well, war, we're fighting wars because we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. Well, I want to tell you, drones do not discriminate. Nuclear weapons do not discriminate. Modern warfare, we're not talking about, like, don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes, right? We're talking about somebody in Idaho pushing a button that fires a drone on the other side of the world, and if somebody happens to step out into the path of that drone, which, some little kid, some pregnant woman, that drone's not going to change course. And poverty and racism are equal opportunity killers. And when we were transitioning from Pro-Lifers for Survival to the Seamless Garment Network, I remember a Franciscan priest at this meeting, and he said, don't say to me that poverty is not a direct killer and that war and poverty aren't related. He said, because I'll tell you about standing in a war-torn country with a dying child in my arms who was dying for lack of human resources and American warplanes flying over. He said that was his personal experience. And so for him, that was a very real and visceral connection. We don't all have those experiences, but we can all learn from each other's experiences. So I think in connecting the issues, we have to look at like underlying value about life. So I mentioned yesterday, I always want to make a bumper sticker that says respect life, practice nonviolence, because that to me is really what we're talking about. That we have a lot of problems in our world, but solving them with violence is not the way. It's not a logical way, it's not a respectful way, it's certainly not a Christian Catholic way. And so how do we use what Jesus gave us, how do we use the gospel of love to address these real and severe problems in a way that, remember, what would Jesus do? I mean, I don't mean to oversimplify things, but really we have to look at, I think, each of the things we face as a society and as individuals through that lens of what is the proper approach to solving this problem? And can we have collateral damage? Is that the proper approach? Collateral damage in war, collateral damage in euthanasia, collateral damage in the death penalty, in abortion. I mean, is that acceptable? And to me, the answer is no. It's not acceptable to me as a Catholic Christian. It's not acceptable to me as a reasoning person. So we have to find a different way to approach these things. And that doesn't mean we have to work on all of them at the same time, but at least to recognize how they're related and that our approach to each has to encompass that vision of respecting life and nonviolently approaching the problems that we see. I want to say one other thing real quickly. So one of the things I found when I was Googling an article from the National Catholic Reporter, sorry, and he had, they're both good, but this one's from the Reporter. And it was entitled 4 Ways to Heal the Divide Between Pro-Life and Social Justice Advocates. I'm not going to read it to you. If you want to read it, you can look it up yourself. But I'll tell you what the 4 ways that this person proposed. And the first is to take pride in consistency. That our Catholic commitment to protecting human life and dignity is so compelling and overreaching that we should be proud of that idea. You know, that our Catholic social teaching is really a treasure, and we should embrace that. The other is to accept the idea of political homelessness. And I know we all wish that there was a political home, but there's just not. And I was very excited last week that the Democratic Party said that they would tolerate some pro-life people to be in their rankings. You know, that wasn't the litmus test anymore. Whether that really happens or not remains to be seen. But we know that politics is not our savior. In this room, our savior is Jesus Christ, right? And so politics are a tool we can use, but they're not going to save us. So we have to live in that tension, is what he's saying. However, we have to acknowledge that the state, and this is, again, this man's column, the state plays valid roles in matters of both life and justice. And so even though we can't look to politics as our savior, we have to recognize that it's part of the game, right? It's part of what happens. And so we have to keep our faith, but get in the streets, get in the voting booth, get in the jails, do what we need to do to engage politics, even while knowing that that's not our ultimate saving grace. And then lastly, what this fellow, whose name, by the way, is Mike Jordan Lasky, he's out of Camden, New Jersey, which is just down the road here. The last thing he says is that we need to break bread together. And so for us as Catholics, you know, we can't lose focus of why do we believe these things that we believe? Because our church and our Lord teaches us and taught us about the sanctity of all life. Because we are all made in the image of a loving God. And so we are to mirror that image and also to try to continue to bring that image to fruition in our world.
So for me, I wanted to work for the church. I come from the smallest diocese in the country, which is Baker in Eastern Oregon, which is 11 people. And so if they're all at lunch, the bishop answers his own phone, you know. And then I moved.
It's supposed to be.
And so when I moved to Portland for family issues, then all of a sudden people worked for the church. I'd never met a pastoral associate you work for the church? I want to do that. And they said, you need a master's in theology. And I'm like, all right. So I looked all around, and I said, if I need another master's degree, then I'm going to get it in what I want. So I looked around the schools that did not require a GRE exam, and chose one that had a degree in justice ministry. So that's my Master's of Arts is in justice ministry. Not in social justice. Not specifically. I wanted it generic. I know the issues. I don't want that. My interest is in dialoguing with the people at the parish level whose heart is very much Catholic and love Jesus, but have in no way an understanding of the homeless parked on the streets and the corners. They just don't see it. They just don't see it. So that's what I term the movable middle. How can I help them go from where they are to a little bit more to the other end on this spectrum, let's say, like of a rainbow? So my first class at Catholic Theological Union, which has the degree in justice ministry, was of course a social justice class, my field. But the thing that just astounded me was the phrase, error has rights. With the shift in Vatican II, error has rights. And I'm like, what do you mean? What do you mean? And through great dialogue, I learned that prior to Vatican II, if you remember, only Catholics went to heaven. Oh, of course. Only Catholics went to heaven. Error, those who don't believe as we believe, have no rights. So it said, even look at the Crusades as they're heading to the Holy Land. Oh, you find some Jews, whack the heads off, keep going. Oh, you don't believe, whack, whack, whack. The error has no rights. With Vatican II, I think it's Jutatis Humanus, but Vatican II, all of a sudden, our document on religious liberty, error has rights. Huge shift in thinking that you are right, you are made in the image and likeness of God. And even though we can say on paper that's been our teaching of our church for 2,000 years, that is not our lived practice till the 60s. And then it took another decade to try to figure out what it is. And the Jews have rights. Oh my, they're our older brothers. Oh, okay. Error has rights. So with this discovery in that one class, things sort of made sense. And I didn't want to go into social justice issues and take global poverty and women's issues and all that. I said, no, I need to know what these people who only know that error has no rights, what do they know? So I took classes in Mariology and ecclesiology and the basic theological things so I can use their language. So what I found is the pro-life people are very much have their language, and the social justice people have their language. And I'm like, no, I'm Catholic morning, noon, and night. I want to know what you speak. I need to know your words. So I took all the, church classes so I could speak the words of my faithful people who want to call the cops on every homeless person they see, all right? And don't see Jesus in that person. Yet I want to work with the pro-lifers who it's only until they're born, then they're fine. Okay, well, when they're poor and they're still born, they're still poor. And in fact, Catholic Charities came and did a regional training in Portland, and we were able to only get one really strong advocate on the pro-life parish level to attend. And so I'm meeting with her and debriefing, and she goes, well, I went to that class on poverty, but every time they talked about poverty, I changed it in my mind to the poverty of spirit. And I'm like, no, they're really hungry. They really are poor. She couldn't see it. So I'm like, here's this wonderful, faithful woman who believes in life and loves being Catholic and doesn't see Jesus like I see Jesus. How do I know her language? Okay? So for me, that was very, very important. And so what I've done is try to figure out their dialogue. And I have history of this. When I was a very strong pacifist, still am, and so in college at Gonzaga, I did 2 years of ROTC. How can I be against the military if I don't know what you're being taught? How do I know your language? How can I talk with you if I don't know? And so it's like, all right, I've got to go there to figure out where you're at. And so one of the things we did, I was a CCHD, Catholic Campaign for Human Development intern at the Archdiocese of Portland. And my job was to find the gatekeepers, the movers and shakers. If I want something in your bulletin coming from the Office of Life, Justice, and Peace, who do I need to get it passed? It's certainly not the pastor. Who writes your bulletin? Where's the secretary? Who do I need to fall in love with? Okay, all that kind of stuff to figure it out. When I finally figured out this massive database of all these people constantly talking, because again, Oregon, the Archdiocese of Portland is 6 hours top to bottom, so there's no way I could ever meet them all. And so then I created a survey, just SurveyMonkey, with all these questions, and I said, here are all these issues, and this is where the director of the Office of Life, Justice, and Peace very clearly said these are the issues. Where are you on totally compassionate to couldn't really care? To see where it was. And this was sent to all the Respect Life people, all the social justice people, anybody's email I got. When I got it back and compiled it, there was one issue that they were both concerned with, all right? And that was human trafficking. And I said, this is where we need to have our workshop, our day together. This is where we need to go. I said, I'm in both of your camps. I know you all. I love you all. Come together for a day. But I had to survey them. What's your issue? What is it that you want? And so by doing that, finding that, I was able then, and again within Archdiocese of Portland, being that it's 6 hours apart, you have to do an urban one, a rural one, a KKK area one, all that kind of stuff in those different areas. So very much looking at those things. And then on the one-on-one capacity, dealing at the parish level, I've been able then just to dialogue with people who, again, great people, great people. But it's just like, oh man, I just called the cops on that. The RVs are sitting out there in the church, out in front of the parking lot. And I'm like, okay, well, we're supposed to house the homeless. Can they come and live in your house, in your bedroom, in your extra room? No. Well, can they put up their tent in your backyard? No. Can they move their RV to the front of your house and you could protect them and let them stay? No. Then let them stay at our church where it's just a sidewalk, because, I don't want you to go to hell. I want to be with you in heaven. Come on. Matthew 25. Can I read it to you? Okay? Really concrete. Concrete. We're not using hoses on them when they're asleep by the fence. Little things that the maintenance guys think is the good thing. And so what I've done is within the Secular Franciscan fraternities and regions is I'll go and give presentations about error has rights. We have to start with that foundation and recognize the earthquake that was Vatican II to say, where are we on our values? And then we have to look at, again, language, defining terms, because if we say equality is important, let's say equality for higher education, without defining it, what we've found sociologically is conservatives think that equality means access to. You can apply to Harvard, you can do this, you can just fill out the form, it's access to. More the social justice people think it's the outcome. How many people graduate from those schools? How many don't just have access, but make it through the door? And so the definitions, their language is different. So you have to go and learn their language to be able to dialogue with them, to say, oh, okay, but have you thought about this? So one of the things that helps me really stay grounded is a great quote from Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln says, I don't like that man. I must get to know him better. Because there's got to be something. Could be kind of a beer. Could be, who knows, they love their mothers. Something that they can find in common. But if you don't go toward them, you only have the identity of what you're not for. So building structures then within the parishes, it's like the language. I didn't know, coming from little tiny Baker diocese where we didn't have social justice anyway, that social justice is a very political term. I mean, to me it was, I didn't know that. And so I got shot down a few times. And I'm like, the term is not important whatsoever. The value is important. We are Catholic. We do this because we are Catholic, not because they're Catholic. It's because it cannot not come out of us. Because we are Catholic. And so then what word can I use that's not social justice, not respect life, not whatever the push buttons are? It's like, no. So one of the things we're doing is to help within our society, the general society, the pro-birthers that we want them, they have to be born. I said, look, the church is not supporting our pro-life perspective of life from conception. What do we celebrate? Christmas, the birth. We need to celebrate the incarnation. As a Franciscan, it's always the incarnation. Most people call it the Annunciation. It's the incarnation. If we as a church make the feast of the incarnation bigger than Christmas, then we have all of life. We're only, as a church, liturgically celebrating the birth. So, of course, our society is the birth. Our media is the birth. Let the church be a prophet and go back to March 25th, with the exception of this year, to that celebration. And so, in fact, we are. We're starting as our teeny tiny parish. It's only 1/3 Anglo, mostly Asian and Indian and Somali and Croatian. And we're going to have a giant baby party on the Feast of the Incarnation. And it's a little thing you guys can do in your parishes. To say we're not birthers, we are lifers. So thank you.
I'm not an expert on getting the respect life and the social justice together. It's something I'm passionate about, and it's something for which I look for opportunities, and it's something for which I create opportunities. I've had some things that work and some things that don't work, and I want to share some of the things that have worked for me. And those are things that you may want to try. I've been a member of Pax Christi, the Catholic Peace, Justice, Nonviolence group there for, gosh, it's like maybe, I don't know, 94. I said, hey guys, I want to talk about the Parish pro-life group, the Respect Life group, together with us to talk about war as a life issue. Could we plan that? And to be honest, and I love Pax Christi, and I love my friends in Pax Christi, but some of them, they were just kind of skeptical, like, I don't think that's going to work. It's kind of a waste of time. And one guy said, it won't work. And I go, well, how do you know? And he goes, they just care about abortion. I said, well, how do you know? And he goes, well, because every Respect Life Month, they have their table out there in the vestibule, and it's always about abortion, which actually is not true at my parish. And he says, and I go up there and I go, how come you always talk about abortion and you don't talk about war? And I was like, oh, how does the conversation go after that, right? So I didn't convince them, but I didn't give up, and so here's what I did. I joined the Parish Respect Life group. And what I want to say is if you're mainly a justice person, you could join the pro-life group. If you're maybe a pro-life person, you could join the social justice group. Now here's the thing. It wasn't insincere. I've always been pro-life on abortion since I first heard of it. I just wasn't active on it. And my thought was, so many people are working on abortion. And I didn't say anything about war for months. I got related to everyone in the Respect Life group, and I got involved in the vigils we did at Planned Parenthood and the meetings we had. So they transformed me, really. Like, I didn't realize how massive, I didn't realize there was like 3,500 abortions a day, or I was just flabbergasted. And that while there are a lot of people that are vocal on pro-life, there's really, I don't think, enough people that are actually active on it. So I became active, and I got related to them, and then when we were planning the next Respect Life Month, I was like, whoa, they actually do, they're going to have it, on 1 week, they're going to have something on the death penalty. They're going to have something. It was wild. And when I asked about war, I was ready, for debate mode. And what she said in her Cajun accent was, yeah, let's do that. That, as far as I'm concerned, social justice and pro-life are the same thing. It's about the dignity and sanctity of everybody's life. And I was like, wow. So we planned out Respect Life Month. And my wonderful pastor, a friend of Jared's there, Bill Walk, who's the bishop-elect now of Pensacola, Tallahassee, I was talking to him about this. I wanted to make a brochure about war as a life issue, and he approved that, and we made that. And so then I called Pax Christi, Austin, my friends, and I said, hey, would you guys like to hand out a brochure for part of Respect Life Month where we talk about Franz Jägerstätter, who was beatified for refusing to fight in the Nazi army, where we talk about unjust war, where we kind of question unjust war a little bit and talk about nonviolence, and where we offer a resource for veterans, a Catholic resource, David's Heart Ministry, for veterans with moral injury. And they were like, what? And they were really excited to do it, and they said, how did you do this? And I said, come here, I'll tell you a secret. I got related to people and I had a conversation. And that's, to me, that is so key. When Evelyn is talking about seeking out people and learning their language, and when Fran is talking about this, being triggered and being angry, and I don't have a lot of money, but I spent some money and I got some training from a group called Landmark Education. That's a lot of like applied philosophy and kind of recognizing your brain patterns and stuff, and noticing when I get triggered, and I have in no way mastered this by far, but being able to have a choice about not just what I'm going to do, but a choice about how I'm going to be, where before there was no choice, right? Where this guy says something, he says this, I get angry, I say that. Now this guy says this, I get angry, I go, wait a minute. Do I have to get angry about this? No, I don't. It's not. Anyway, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about it, but those things are possible. So knowing your triggers is really good. The other thing I want to say is to give up our assumptions. Some of my friends in Pax Christi, they assumed that the pro-life group wasn't going to do anything on war, right? And you assume that these social justice people don't want to do anything on abortion. And it could very well be that they do, and they don't have the bandwidth, like Fran's talking about, right? Or maybe they wanted to do, maybe they'll do it one time or something. So, and I tell people just to ask, and you don't know what's going to happen. And I learned some of that from Carol Cross. Yeah, when the Supreme Court ruled on the Texas HB 2 law about the restrictions for hospital quality, and they struck it down. At the same time, the Supreme Court took up 2 death penalty cases from Texas. And Carol was visiting me in Texas, and I told her this, and she goes, well, why don't we have a press conference on both? And I was like, okay. And I took her to meet a friend of mine that runs the Central Texas Coalition on Life, which is focused on abortion. And Carol just said, hey, we want to do this. Would you do it? And she said, yeah. And I was like, can it be that easy? It's not always that easy. But don't assume that this person is this way and this person is that way and this group is that way. Ask. One of the other things that I've done that's worked without changing the focus of an organization is to just do a one-off event that will change, hopefully, some thinking and have people maybe get related and start having conversations. Last year for Respect Life Month, we had Pax Christi and the Respect Life Ministry co-hosted an event on racism as a life issue. And while we spoke mostly about racism, and when introducing it, I talked about why we say Black Lives Matter in kind of the same context as why we say unborn lives matter. These are the lives that are facing challenges with life itself and challenges with dignity. And we did another one on the death penalty, and to talk about things as both a justice issue and a life issue. And I think that's, that in and of itself isn't necessarily going to change a bunch of minds, but I think it's a good start to do that. There's these bumper stickers that say social justice begins in the womb, or war is not pro-life. I know Rehumanize International has that, I think, on a shirt now. I think that kind of stuff is great. Or to talk about, I can't think of his last name. There's an ex, like OBGYN that used to perform abortions that now has an abortion-free clinic somewhere, and he has this quote that's in something put out by Catholic Peace Fellowships that says, the heart of social justice is the gospel of life. And so I really think that if we want peace, there's a lot of things that are required for peace, but peace requires justice. No one feels at peace when they're being treated unjustly, even if you're not physically fighting, right? But if we want to have justice, we have to respect the dignity of people's lives, whether we think they're air or whether they make us angry. And so really, at the heart of peace, I think, is respecting the sanctity of life. That's what I've got. And then I guess now maybe I'd like to spend a few minutes, if we want to hear maybe comment on each other's things or ask each other a question, and then open it up, not just for you guys asking, we're all participants in this conference. If you're doing something that works or something you think would work, I want to hear it.
Well, one of the things I just want to make a comment is there are 2 phrases that have worked really, really well, and I recommend them to everybody. So one phrase is, tell me more. Tell me more. Tell me more. And the other one is, I hear what you're saying. Works really good with spouses. I hear what you're saying. I'm not agreeing with you at all. But I hear what...
Figured that scam out.
I know. But I hear what you're saying. And I'm not agreeing with you. I'm not going anywhere. But I hear what you say, because most people want to be validated, to be heard. But if you can say, tell me more, sort of that goes off of Abraham Lincoln's of getting to know them more. Tell me more, and I hear what you're saying.
I think Mary's comment
Oh, good.
about political homelessness with the importance of politics is very important. And the Archbishop's made this point both publicly and privately, that the 2016 election really was, in a bizarre, backhanded way, a gift, because both of the candidates were so completely, compellingly bad that kind of introduced a clarity in mind about what is it, why are we getting so excited and so frantic about this thing? So I mean, that point is very important. The points that have been made about personal contact, I can't underline that strongly enough. Melissa Nussbaum is a columnist for the National Catholic Reporter, a magazine journal. It's a wonderful trigger mechanism for me. But Melissa is a person who really kind of gets what we're talking about and attempts to, and does a good job at living the holistic Christian idea of what a human person is and the dignity that he or she should be given. Final thing is that when people get called pro-abortion, I keep reminding myself that people who are in favor of abortion rights aren't always pro-killing young people. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. You have to be careful about your language. In the same sense, when I hear the word pro-birther, I get very upset, because that implies that I don't, look, I've got 4 disabled family members. The idea that I'm not interested in the government being appropriately involved in providing support for them is nuts. And I actually have never met a pro-lifer that pulls the ripcord at birth, that just doesn't care about it. I mean, those people don't exist. They're stick figures. In the same way that pro-lifers sometimes, or maybe many times, think about, well, abortion's kind of an idolatry for people. There's a little bit of truth in both of those images, but a lot of untruth, and we need to keep that in mind. So political homelessness and politics is important. Living that paradox is where Christians have always been. I mean, you find it in Augustine, for heaven's sakes. And that leads me to the final point, which is that we're talking and exchanging these views are important, but as Father Taglianetti and Sister know, and I'm sure you do as well, Father, I mean, there's a holistic image, a holistic understanding of who the human person is in Christian Catholic teaching. It's very important that we just not stop with the issue we're concerned with, but really drill down into the social teaching of the Church, because it's organic. The teaching on sexuality, the teaching on homelessness, the teaching on abortion, on euthanasia, genocide, poverty, which is really significant problem in inner city Philadelphia. Those are all connected. They're not separate categories. They're connected organically, and you don't get that unless you have a sense of what JP2 called Christian anthropology. Who is man, and what's his purpose, and where does our dignity really come from? In a Christian perspective, we don't invent it. God gives. We don't kill people because they're sons and daughters of God, not because of John Rawls or some other excuse. I mean, that's our argument, and that we should be frank about it. Be willing to argue that point.
So on the note of young people and this issue, I found, I'm a young person. I attended here at Eastern University for 2 years. Now I'm at Millersville 4 years later. And I've noticed with the dialogue that goes on that a lot of my friends who are very interested in social justice here, the motto here is faith, reason, and justice. And so there's a lot of us were interested in social justice. Some of us were political socialists or Marxists. And what I found is that it's interesting because it's a weird space where, particularly here, but also I think generally in young Catholics and young people around the country, is that I found that a lot of us who were in that sort of place in economics and other things, they come into the church. I'm meeting with a couple of those people tonight, and they're all Catholic, they're all traditional, they like to go to Latin Mass. It's a fascinating little thing where we have this merging of sort of social justice and economics and things like that, and traditional Catholicism. And I'm at Millersville now, and I'm at the Newman House, and there's we've had two people, at least one person come into the church who was very liberal, and it was through talking on that level of sort of a Marxian economic system and bridging the gap on that level and saying, hey, look, social justice, we can move forward with this, and then through that avenue, convincing them on the pro-life issues. And so now they're very much a pro-life person because they think in those terms. If we can come in and speak, I think that there's a big ally in those circles if you can just get them to be convinced about that, like that aspect of like the justice sort of thing on those like economic terms. And then especially if you take those economic terms and say, like let's use that like sort of Marxian, or not necessarily Marxian, but like distributist even, sort of economic model to like go and help, these poor mothers and things like that. And I think you can bridge that gap kind of easily. It still takes conversation, but I think that there's a lot of hope there, and we can really become a bigger, more broader, and inclusive community in that regard. We just need open minds.
You're not dragging it around the 60s, we are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Emma?
Hi, yes. Well, first of all, thank you all so much for this discussion. I feel like already I've learned a lot. And I was just wondering, in my experience as a young Catholic woman in her 20s, and in kind of like the circles I run with and the other Catholic women I know, I went to a Catholic women's college. When it comes to abortion, I know a lot of times there's kind of this schism between young Catholic women and the priests and the bishops and the cardinals who do say, abortion is sinful and this is the church teaching. And in a lot of ways, it just feels like another patriarchal institution telling women what to do. So my question for you all is, if there were more women in leadership positions in the church, like if women were eventually could be working as deacons, priests, etc., do you think more young Catholic women could get on board with being anti-abortion? That's just something I've been wrestling with.
I don't, because I think it's really basic. If they don't have understanding of the dignity of life from the moment of conception, that the rest is just window dressing. The structure that is created, the women deacons isn't a big issue. That could be the stroke of the Pope's pen. Never going to be priests. Not. But I think really what I've seen it as is really looking at the values of our church, and are you, to quote Dan Berrigan, are you an American Catholic or are you a Catholic American? And if I am Catholic first, I have no party. I go with life, and it's not the men in charge of our church, and it's hard. And I don't know because I'm so isolated from a Catholic population. Oregon is 4% Catholic. I use YouTube a lot, and so there's a wonderful professor actually across the street at Villanova, Massimo Fagioli, and he talks about, because as an Italian coming to the United States and being Catholic in the United States, and such a shock of how really our Catholic Church is very evangelical, because we are surviving in this pronouncedly Protestant culture. And so the question of being Catholic before American is a very concrete question. And where do we have an identity? So I'm a junkie for him on YouTube.
So can I say that I see your hand? So could we go 1, 2, 3 after? I think you
Well,
want
I
to say
just
something.
wanted to comment on this. I think we need to, one of the things that Karl Wojtyła said very early in his pontificate, and Francis has said nothing different, was that the church has no need of ideologies. All she needs is the gospel. And when I hear words like transphobic and homophobic and patriarchal, that just is a yellow light for me. Because that's the language of political systems that are fundamentally alien to the Catholic experience. Doesn't mean that they're false. Doesn't mean that they have some truth to them. But I just be really careful about language, because the church is a fundamentally different organism from our political culture. And we're hierarchical by nature, because that's human nature, and it doesn't seem it doesn't seem like, it seems very likely to me that women will have more and more influence in the church, but only to the degree that it doesn't violate the fundamental nature of the church. And so I'm just, I guess because I was an editor before that, a writer, I'm just really conscious of what words mean and the language and the ideology behind the language. The whole idea of patriarchy to me is just a yellow light, because I don't know any weak women. In my family, when the clouds started to gather over my daughters and my wife or my sisters, I headed for the hills. It just was safer. And they were intelligent, they were willful, and they had an enormous amount of influence. So I don't belly feel that issue.
So we have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. Is that right? And let me just say quickly, I always think about, people say, oh, the world would be better if it was run by women, and I think about like Margaret Thatcher and Indira Gandhi, and I think, well, maybe. But I do actually see a place for women in leadership in the Catholic Church. But I'm not sure that that's really the problem that our young Catholic women have with abortion. I think it's really a basic misunderstanding of what abortion really is, and not only, and I don't want to discount the child who is killed, but also how that impacts the woman who was pregnant with the child and the surrounding community. And so it's of course you have to go to the heart of the matter, which is the child who's killed, but that reverberates in a lot of ways. And the misogyny of abortion, which, as I said, that's a topic for another time, but we could talk about later if you want. So I think if young women and men can look at sort of the whole picture instead of just that one little part, that there might be a different understanding. But I do have hopes for women leading in our church. That's also a topic for another time. So.
Hi, I'm Susan, and you're talking about the tension between the right to life and social justice, but another tension I feel is between advocacy and charity. So in Washington, D.C., which is a very political place, our diocese no longer has a social concerns office, and a lot of the parishes don't also. And charity is good because you get to you get to meet the homeless, but what's happening is a lot of this charity now, we don't have the advocacy, we don't have social justice, but it's antiseptic. I put money to take care of that homeless person, or I cook something and I put it in someone's trunk, and I don't have those encounters. And those border crossings is what gives you the compassion to realize you have to do some advocacy. And I see a lot of these issues are being, it's easy to have a blind spot as a parishioner if you're only doing charity, and it's a very antiseptic way, and you never get to that advocacy.
It's like the temple tax. We just pay the temple to take care of the poor.
Are you a Just Faith grad?
No, I'm a Pax Christi.
Okay, with the encounter and border crossing, I just asked.
fine.
One of the things that I think it's really, I think education that moves people from charity to justice is really important. I probably wouldn't be sitting here if when I was at Loyola University, they had this thing called LUCAP, Loyola University Community Action Program, and they moved us. It was, what do you call that? Service learning. They moved us from charity to justice. One of the things that we did is every couple of weeks we would make these lunches and we'd bring them to this park and give them to these homeless persons, but we wouldn't give out sandwiches and leave. We stayed there and had the encounters and heard the stories. And then on the bus back, we talked about structural and how people became homeless. Some of these folks that used to work on the docks and on the ships, the corporations that did the shipping, just flew another nation's flag so they didn't have to follow OSHA and safety rules. And then these guys were out of jobs, and we became friends, and it profoundly moved me. And a piece that I'd left out of the Respect Life group at my parish saying, yeah, let's do that. Just Faith had been in my parish for 15 years.
We're not allowed to do it in DC.
And I want to say, this is not known well. There is Just Faith doesn't necessarily have an abortion thing, but there's an addendum that you can get from Just Faith, that you have to ask for it, that weaves abortion into the Just Faith curriculum, but you have to ask for it. It's there if it helps move your pastor or your bishop or whatever. It's there.
Yeah, but the USCCB won't approve Just Faith anymore.
Oh, I did not know that. I was unaware of that.
What's the reasoning behind the elimination of the social concerns?
They said Catholic Charities does everything and it's redundant.
And these Catholic Charities, I don't know how it's structured in the Archdiocese of Washington, but does your Catholic Charities operation, for us as Catholic Human Services, do you have some element within that organization that actually does advocacy?
A little bit. It's mostly charity.
Not a lot. I mean, Catholic Charities is a very extensive service organization in metropolitan Washington, the Archdiocese of Washington.
Right.
But I would give it credit for having a robust issue advocacy thing. It does some of the, they'll talk about hunger because they can feed people, and they might talk about shelter some because they shelter people. But going into this deeper, from charity to justice, reaching that depth and then working from it, that's pretty prioritized.
And the parishioners have no interaction to Catholic Charities except dumping money there.
Right.
Sorry,
The charities itself doesn't have a relationship to the individual parishes in the diocese except as fund us.
Okay, we gotta keep going.
When did you graduate from Loyola?
What's that?
When did you graduate from Loyola?
97.
Oh, okay. I did that in 2000. I graduated in 2004. I would go bring the sandwich. It's funny. Anyway, I did the same thing that he talks about. Yeah, but I actually wanted to, I didn't want to brush over your point about, how important it is for women to be, kind of speaking about, pro-life issues, and frankly, I think leading the conversation. It's really something to keep in mind, I think. I mean, obviously, the issue of, the church leadership being all men is, it just is what it is, and it's not gonna, that's separate, but I think that it is important for that reason for women to be speaking out about abortion and to be kind of, and in my opinion, the leading voices often, or as often as possible, not to discount, the importance of everyone speaking out about it, but it is framed as a bunch of men telling women what to do and trying to control women's bodies. And, it's important, I think, that we be cognizant of that in our messaging.
So Bruce, then Richard, then I can't read her name.
Suzanne.
Although it's a very difficult book, I think one of the things, a book that would really help the woman that you were speaking of is George and Tollefson's book, Embryo in Defense of Life. Because first, it's difficult because it's a very rigorous text. And it goes into the science of embryology. So there's not one religious or Catholic argument used. So divorce yourself from Catholics and the hierarchy and priests. Just look at the science of embryology and look at the science of philosophy and rigorous thinking. And they, I think, make the greatest defense of life beginning at conception than any other thing I've ever read. Although that's on it, many times people will come to conversion or to this issue emotionally, some experience in their life. So in one way, my argument isn't the greatest because it's intellectual. But if they want to see a real solid defense, one's a professor at Princeton, the other is a professor at down south, North Carolina, I'm not sure, but Tollefson and George. And when they wrote about the science of embryology, and then they defended it against all of the research that they want to use with embryos, there was no one left standing after that except them. So it's a very convincing book. But sometimes it's not an intellectual issue. It's an emotional one, some other
thing. Just to Emma's point about patriarchy. To dismiss patriarchy is like dismissing racism because we have a black president, so we shouldn't delve into racism. I think we have to look at Avery Dulles' models of the church. One is hierarchy or institution, but there's church as community, church as herald of justice, pilgrim, servant, more than institutional hierarchy. Patriarchy, the monolith of patriarchy needs to be addressed, for sure.
Go ahead, I'm sorry, I do want to respond to that though.
Awesome. So one of the things that concerns me with the institutional Catholic Church is when they use the word paramount or basic or foundational.
Or extrinsic equal.
Yeah, and you have groups that hand out the pamphlets that provide non-negotiables at all the parishes the Sunday before the election, heralding someone who's as pro-life and continue to do so in the literature after months of this administration, I would say being anything but pro-life. Astounding, confounding.
Can I respond to that? I think it's important, in my years of experience in this job, whenever I hear the word institutional church, those words always make me a little bit uneasy because the institutions of the Catholic Church are the necessary skeletal structure that sustains and feeds in some ways the soul of the church, which is us, right? I mean, you can't separate, and I think Francis has made this point, John Paul certainly did, that the idea of separating the real church from the institutional church is just a false dichotomy. You can't separate them. The institutions are fundamental and they're necessary to the life of the church. Now they change over time according to the cultural influences that, historical influences, but it's dangerous. It's dangerous to separate those two things because we need the institutions. All right, I understand that, I accept that. The other thing about the patriarchy issue is I'm not disputing that historically women have been treated poorly, although I think Christianity has a much better record than some of the other monotheistic religions. But that's a fact. You know, I've got a daughter. I want her treated with appropriate respect and have her flourish. I don't want her suppressed by some sort of idea that she's an inferior citizen to my sons. I mean, that's just, that I don't think people think like that. But my point about patriarchy is we need to be very, very careful about language because language shapes thought. And so if the issue is, look, we need more room for women to breathe in the church, we need more room for them to contribute and to lead, hey, I'm all in for that. But patriarchy for me suggests a political feminism that I have real problems with because it leads inevitably to the kind of callousness toward abortion that I've seen develop since 1973, and that I got a real problem. And I also believe very strongly that if I love my wife and I respect my daughter and my sisters, it's not because I've learned from Gloria Steinem, it's because I read it in Scripture. Scripture is its own explanation, and that's not the right word. I mean, Scripture is the Word of God. I believe that full-heartedly, and I just think I always go back to that as the grounding for how I think about who men and women really are. I don't need, the Republican or the Democratic Party or political movements to tell me about those things. Although, sometimes they contribute to my thought, obviously, but they're not primary.
Thank you for clearing that up. I think that goes to show that you and I may be working from different definitions of what patriarchy means, which I think goes to show that, in this type of dialogue, which can get really heated, it's important to know the vocabulary of the other person.
Can I make one other observation? That I think, James, I saw you shaking your head when or agreeing when I mentioned Alistair McIntyre. Was that correct?
Oh.
Yeah, McIntyre is really interesting because McIntyre came to his Christian faith because he, mainly through Aristotle and then through Thomas, he had been a hardline Marxist from the 1960s. He's never entirely repudiated his Marxism, because Marx has a lot to say about the structure and the operations of capitalist society that we would really do well to listen to. So that's why I made the point about thinking clearly. We got to be able to make distinctions and take what's right and drop what's wrong in people's experience.
So I'd like to give you a chance, and then we're down to our last 4 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that I'm happy to say that there's at least 4 feminist pro-life organizations that have tables for some materials out in this area. So this is not a foreign idea anymore, and it would have really helped me make peace in being both pro-women and pro-life. So I think that's really important to address, that there are a lot of women doing this. I shouldn't say a lot, but several, many, women doing this sort of thing. And as someone, I'm the life issues coordinator for my diocese in Western New York, and it really, we have a unique structure. I work under Catholic Charities and as part of a Justice and Peace staff team, so it's very unique. But it still has its own challenges, and there's obviously still the dichotomies that we face that we talk about in this room. So, I think it's true that learning the language has helped a lot. I know the language. I've been in many different organizations, and it really, really helps, because people make a lot of assumptions. And so I just think that's huge. So I really appreciate that you really work on that.
Any last word?
Karl Marx had, Marxist feminism talks, it's where I think the idea of patriarchy comes from. So I think it's odd to, on one hand, kind of dismiss that use of that word, and then, never mind.
Real quick question. What are some venues that you can suggest that you can draw Catholics to communicate Catholic social teaching? Whenever you have something in a parish that says anything like that, you get a handful of people who come. What are some practical venues where you can draw people in and communicate this message?
And not preach to the choir?
And not preach to the choir. And the only thing I can think of really is Mass, because that's where everybody's at. And very seldom do you hear a Catholic social teaching homily. I've been around to a lot of dioceses, I can tell you, it just doesn't happen very often. I don't want to pick on the clergy, but they're the only ones that have the captive audience. So other than that, we need the seminaries to change, I think, to teach this. But that's a much bigger question. But practically, on the grassroots level, how can we draw people in to communicate these messages?
That's why, for me, having that survey was so important. I needed to know what these individual people were interested in. So when I did the Survey Monkey, to find out that there's one commonality on human trafficking, it was like, bingo. Now I know where to bake the cookies for, So
I have one, and it's not necessarily the venue. It's the wording that you can talk about dignity when you're talking about justice and get live people to come. The other is 2 years ago, the Catholic Mobilizing Network and the Texas Catholic Conference. We were working together to have a Texas state march to the Capitol on the death penalty, and they wanted to call it a walk for hope and mercy. And I said, I fought for this. I said I wanted to call it a walk for life, hope, and mercy. And we did. And once we did that, then what I was able to do was invite the Knights of Columbus, because when we have the March for Life on the Roe v. Wade anniversary, the Knights of Columbus are up in front. And I got to be honest, I don't like swords and military outfits, but the photograph and the feathers are nice. But the
Feathers are out.
And it got rained out. But here's the thing: the Knights of Columbus agreed to do this when we added the word life. Yeah. And what I wanted was a photograph of Knights of Columbus in their fourth-degree regalia leading a march to end the death penalty, because the photograph alone says this is not a leftist Catholic issue, this is a Catholic issue.
That's a good way.
Yeah.
I had a question about the women in leadership. I'm aware that according to Catholic teaching, women priests isn't a thing, and I'm aware that women deacons is hazy. But as far as I understand it, the cardinals are the tradition that they be bishops is not necessary. So if anyone knows, is it possible to have lay people be cardinals?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so then we could have like women potentially.
Yes, yeah, Cardinal's an advisor.
Okay,
And
well that
people
sounds
go-
like a great idea. We should do.
Avery Dulles was a.
Sounds like a great compromise.
Look, Chris Maier, you know, he said this previously too, but I think, probably quite, canonically, you may need to do additional.
That can change. It's a discipline and not a dogma. Discipline and dogma.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, you know what? I think we're following. Okay.
Yeah.
Next time to go.
So we have to find a different way to approach these things, and that doesn't mean we have to work on all of them at the same time, but at least to recognize how they're related